I started off as a wildland firefighter in the 1960s, right after I got out of the Marine Corps. I went on to the Costa Mesa Fire Department about 63 or 64. Went up through the ranks, got promoted to the deputy chief's position eventually, and then I became the fire chief of the city of San Clemente. And that was kind of a seminal change in my career, because San Clemente was a very small community at the time, and Costa Mesa was a fairly large one, so I kind of went to a smaller department. I served in San Clemente for 13 years, and then I went to Fullerton as a fire chief there, and I was there for almost 9 years, and then I left Fullerton to become the state fire marshal for the state of California. I retired as the state fire marshal and chief deputy of what they call CAL FIRE. Started for me personally when I was in the operations division of the Costa Mesa Fire Department. I tell the story, I'll keep it as brief as I can for purposes of this, but I went on a fire in a yacht building one day where every sprinkler head and the system had been turned on. It was a 55-gallon drum of methyl ethyl ketone. And when we put the fire out with the sprinklers that were in the building, we squeegeed the building out and went back in service the same day. A couple of nights later, I had a residential fire, and when I responded to it, I could hear my captain asking for medical assistance and so forth. And when I arrived on the scene, we found that we had a 14-year-old girl who had died in a single-family dwelling trying to escape. And it was a real traumatic event. I kept asking myself the question, why can we protect yachts and can't protect our youth? So a couple of us, and I can name names per se, there was a guy named Bob Beecham, who was the fire marshal at that time. And he and I started experimenting with sprinklers and started putting them into non-traditional occupancies. Then I became the fire chief of San Clemente, and as a result of going to San Clemente in the 1970s, I had a city that was unbuilt. It was a town that was going through a lot of growth and development. When I went there, it was about 18,000 population. Today it's about 70,000 population. So we had a rare opportunity there, and we started experimenting with residential sprinklers, and one thing led to another, and we got it adopted in our local ordinance. And as the old saying goes, the rest was sort of history. Harry Shaw was a very influential man, and so was the United States Fire Administration. There was a lot of people that were involved at that stage in trying to make a determination of how we're going to get sprinkler systems adopted into these types of occupancies. Don Manning in LA City was, at that time, was doing some experimental work. Harry Shaw was working with the U.S. Fire Administration. Was another lady named Kathy Slack, who was with Central Sprinkler, and so forth. And then there was a lot of other guys like Dave Hilton that we've talked about, and Lou Weitzman, et cetera. And how the Fire Administration more or less played a key role at that point in time was that Harry and other people in the Fire Administration started placing emphasis on it. We started doing research. We started having these projects that were questioning the speed of how sprinklers were activating. That's why we came up with the quick response sprinkler head. Harry, we used to kind of joke about him. He was kind of like a little gnome. He was not a fire guy. He came from a federal background, as I recall. Most of his experience had been in the U.S. Postal Service. But once he came into the Fire Administration, he was a very powerful influence. He directed a lot of effort, published a lot of documents, and gave a lot of support to those who were out there trying to do it. I can't tell you the number of times that I had meetings with Harry or I was on the phone with Harry. Well, to say it was controversy was kind of mild. At the time, we had a lot of forces that were arrayed both for and against sprinklers. Most of the people that were opposed to it were asking this really simple question, and I understand why they asked the question. Why are you doing it now? We have never done it for the previous 50 years, and we had all these homes out there that were not sprinklered. Why do it now? And the experimental work that went into it basically was very, very controversial, because there were a lot of unanswered questions, water supply questions, speed of response heads, and so forth. But as I look back on it now, I clearly believe it was vindicated for a couple of reasons. When San Clemente put their systems in, there were maybe 3 people in the entire country that even knew about residential sprinklers. Today, we've got literally hundreds of communities that are using sprinklers in apartment houses, and using them in high-rises, and using them in residential occupancies. We've now got it into the ICC code. It's now becoming more of a common practice and so forth. So we used to joke about the fact that it takes years and years to be an overnight success. So while we passed that ordinance back in the 80s, it probably has been evolving ever since then. I have gone to numerous communities in which the sprinkler systems have been used to offset a particular risk problem in that community, and they've changed the nature of America's fire problem. Statistically, and we still prove this today, statistically most people who die in a fire die in a single-family dwelling. There are parts of this country today where that probability has been reduced to almost zero because they've got so many sprinklers. I'll use San Clemente as a classic example. That town, when I went there, had 18,000 people. Today it's got close to 70,000. Most of those people are protected by residential sprinklers, and the fire loss in that town is very, very low. I had a fire chief the night that we actually had the testimony in front of the city council. He walked up to me, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Son, you've just destroyed your career. You'll never get another job as a fire chief by what you just did." And I said, "Well, why do you believe that?" He said, "Well, you're trying to make fire departments obsolete." And I said, "No, I'm not trying to make fire departments obsolete. What I'm trying to do is make fire departments more effective in doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is protecting life and property." That particular individual is long since retired, and I rest my case that my career was not over. I spent a lot of time after that working at different levels and being involved in different levels of activity regarding sprinklers. But the other controversy was with the building community, and I'll be honest, if I didn't say this, I would be disingenuous, and that is that controversy is still going on. Building industry still sees this as an intrusion into their world. I feel bad about that for the very simple reason that while a man's home might be his castle, it could also be the most dangerous place he goes to sleep. And I'm hoping through the passage of time and the educational process that more and more builders will realize that this is in their best interest too, to build fire protection into the home, make it the safest occupancy there is. So what trade-offs essentially are is balancing the scales between manual firefighting and automatic firefighting. If you don't have sprinklers in buildings, there are certain things you have to have. Wide streets, separation between buildings. You need to have certain construction features in place. Yes. A good example was we changed the hydrant spacing on our fire hydrants. Without sprinklers, we wanted those hydrants as close together as possible. With sprinklers, we moved them a little further apart. That's an economic balancing act. I was never in fire prevention in Costa Mesa of any length of time. I was in the operations division. I was the operations officer, and we had a fire marshal, had several fire marshals that I worked with. And we had a fire chief in those days named John Marshall, who was also a very interesting character. And we had a unique set of circumstances where fire prevention and operations used to work together really closely. That's why we started doing things like, as an operations officer, I participated in plan checking processes, make sure that certain things were built into where the FDC connection was on sprinkler systems and so forth. I would characterize my work in Costa Mesa as being kind of professional curiosity. But it got a lot more focused when I went to San Clemente, because we were building a lot of homes, we were building a lot of apartment houses, and I had a chance down there to do a lot of experimental burning. I must have burned easily 250 buildings in a period of about 4 years. And when you have those experimental burns, you get a chance to set up demonstrations, and you experiment around and so forth. So we started experimenting with sprinklers in those control burns from an operations point of view. That eventually rolled over into putting it into the code itself. Let me characterize that period of time as being one of which there was a great deal of experimentation going on in different parts of the country. We all started talking to each other. It kind of used to be a joke that you couldn't run into Dave Hilton without me being there, and I couldn't run into Harry Shaw without Don Manning being there. There was a small nucleus of people that started working on this concept. Our work in San Clemente was not scientific as much as it was practical. We, in fact, I always tell the story, the first sprinkler system we ever installed in a house was torn out of the lawn. We tore the sprinkler system out of the lawn, turned it upside down, and put it in a building we were going to burn at a place called the Elmore Ranch.
How did it do?
And it worked. We took the plastic pipe and replaced the sprinkler head with a firefighting sprinkler head. The kid that did it, his name was Jim Pingelli. And we started experimenting. We started running tests to see how long it took for on a certain level of carbon monoxide to build up. And about that same time, there was a lot of research going on with the Factory Mutual and with Central Fire Sprinkler, which was a company that was involved in those days. And the network started to expand. What happened was a couple of guys would talk and they'd say, oh, did you hear about what's going on in Cobb County, Georgia? Well, then Cobb County joined us. And then we got talking to Scottsdale, Arizona, and then we got to talking to Corte Madera, California, with a guy named John Montanero. And what we had here was, as the old saying goes, kind of a fire family that was talking amongst each other and experimenting and et cetera. I always make a real distinction between what we did and what testing is. Having a controlled burn is not a test, it's a demonstration. A test is something you do scientifically, in which you sit down and you actually make sure that all the variables are controlled and that your parameters are correct and so forth. So we didn't do any scientific testing, but boy, we did a heck of a lot of demonstrations. And then we started linking up with Don Manning, who was leading that research in LA about we call it RTI, Response Time Index, because we did start seeing the fact that we needed that head to go off faster if it was going to be a life safety issue, because we were working on the premise that that sprinkler head would go off with somebody still in that room with it. And so that's why the change eventually occurred. It was pretty important that we get our elected officials involved in this process, because after all, they were going to be the ones that had to vote on it. And when we did several of our controlled burns, we invited our city council people to come down and participate. My mayor, a fellow by the name of Bill Walker, who was also a local developer, I might add, came and participated in the exercises, dressed him up in turnouts, put him down on his hands and knees, had him crawl inside and watch the sprinkler system go off. One of my claims to fame is I actually set fire to a trailer with Senator Bill Campbell sitting in it. And he used to introduce me, every time he would introduce me, he'd say, this is our fire marshal, Chief Coleman, who tried to set fire to me one day, you know. It was really critical during the early days to get the city council to go along with the mechanisms that we were trying to put into place. So we invited them usually one at a time. We didn't bring them together as a group. The obvious reason for that is you didn't want to have like a prejudicial assembly or anything like that, so we'd invite them down one at a time. It's really interesting because the guy who made the motion to pass the ordinance was the only one that never went on a fire with us. His name was Ed Kalshed, and Ed never went to the experimental burns, but he followed up on everything that we talked to him about. It was real tense. We had a room full of developers and a room full of fire people. A lot of fire guys came from neighboring communities. That was one of the chiefs I was telling you about that walked up and put his hand on my shoulder. He was sitting in the back row. I had about 4 or 5 chief officers there to support us. The way I would characterize the meeting was it was tense, but it was very professional. There was no ranting and raving and throwing, having temper tantrums or anything like that. I made my presentation. The council opened up for general dialogue. There was some feedback, went back and forth. And if you read the book Alpha to Omega, there was an interesting phenomena happened, is that in the middle of the session, there was a motion made to adopt the ordinance. And the motion was made by Mr. Kalshed. And then the debate went on for about another half an hour, and Ed Kalshed said, I make a motion to table the motion. Well, if you understand Robert's Rules of Order, that merely means that you're just putting it down on the table for right now. It doesn't mean you got rid of it at all. So when he tabled the motion, all the developers left. They all got in their trucks and their vehicles and drove off. And he came back after the meeting. He said, okay, I make a motion to return the item to the table. And we finished up the discussion with hardly anybody in the room except for the fire guys.
It was kind of an inadvertent stroke of luck.
It was, we didn't plan it that way. As a matter of fact, I was sitting there on the front row and I already given my presentation and they made the motion to table it, and I looked at my fire marshal and I said, I wonder what that means. And his name was Don Hodgson. And Don looks at me, he just kind of shrugged his shoulders and, I don't know. So everybody started walking out of the council chambers and I walked up to the door where the councilmen were going through and I said, excuse me, councilman. I said, you know, you made a motion to table it. He says, hang around after the coffee break. Okay, I hung around after the coffee break. We put it back on and we proceeded. The first fire actually happened to a apartment complex that was being built on Cazador Lane. And what happened was the building was under construction. It had been tarped, not tarped, but you know, wrapped. It had been wrapped, and they're getting ready for the stucco job. And a maintenance man left a bucket of material in a hallway, and the system had been fully charged because the system was under pressure. We kept the systems under pressure when we were doing certain installations. And I'll be darned if the sprinkler head didn't go off and put the thing out and the fire never got. In fact, the entire fire area you could have covered with a bushel basket. It was just practically nothing. The interesting part of it was the owner of the building was one of the guys who had opposed our ordinance, comes walking into the building, and I could see him coming from, you know, 100 yards away, got out of his pickup truck and he started walking towards the thing, and as soon as he got close enough to make eye contact with me, he shakes his finger at me and says, don't you dare say I told you so. And I said, Al, I will never say I told you so. The first fire was in an apartment complex. Now, subsequent to that, there have been other fires. I left there and went to the fire chief of Fullerton shortly thereafter, so I was not able to sustain the fire statistics, but I do know there have been significant saves in San Clemente. Lou Weitzman was the fire chief of Rural Metro Fire Department, which was in Scottsdale, Arizona. There were actually several people in Scottsdale that we interacted with. Lou was the chief of the department, but he had, and then later on he was replaced by Bob Edwards, and then there was a guy named Jim Ford who was their fire marshal there. Literally speaking, all of us were kind of at the same level of development. We all had the same idea. Everybody talks about, you know, who did this first and who did that first. I kind of call it simultaneous creativity. Mm-hmm. A lot of people were trying the same idea. I have a, yeah, mentioned Dave Hilton from Cobb County, Georgia, and his fire marshal. There was a guy named John Montanero who was involved in Corte Madera. There was a fire marshal in Orange County named Bob Hennessy, who was very encouraging. And then, of course, Don Manning. So when we talk about all these people and all of their involvement, I would characterize it as being kind of like a small group of people who believed in a concept that all started mutually reinforcing each other. When my ordinance was up for adoption, they all showed up. They were in the back row with me. When Scottsdale adopted their ordinance, I was in the front row with the chief of that city. And as time grew and as this got bigger and bigger and bigger, other people got engaged and started getting involved that didn't know each other. But initially, and I'm going to use the word initially as being about a 5 to 7, maybe 10-year span, when sprinklers were first being considered, it was probably really advocated and adopted by less than 100 people. Actually, a residential sprinkler concept has been around since the turn of the century. I actually got ads that were in Saturday Evening Post magazines in the early 1900s talking about putting sprinkler systems in the basement of houses. I think that ideas have to go through certain types of incubation, and that when an idea starts to be generated, it's easily killed when nobody is listening to it. You know, somebody says, I think we ought to learn how to fly. You know, well, nobody knows how to fly, so let's not worry about that until somebody learns to fly. Then all of a sudden there are 10 people that want to learn to fly. Then those 10 people teach 100 people, and those 100 people teach 1,000 people. I attribute the growth of the residential sprinkler movement in the 1970s and 1980s to a convergence of America Burning and its influence on the American Fire Service. Because if you go back and read America Burning, in there it talks about why don't we use sprinklers in houses. It's actually in there. And I may be one of the last of the vanishing breed that actually read that book. I think everybody should. I think anybody that's in the fire profession should have gone through what America Burning had to say originally, because you can really see how much things have changed since then. But that confluence of America Burning, emphasis, the U.S. Fire Administration getting involved, major cities like LA City getting engaged, it was just an idea whose time had come.